Picture this. You're 17 years old, crouched in the hull of a burning ship, watching everything you've ever known about warfare crumble around you. The year is 952 after Christ, and 17-year-old Eirik Weathereye is having what we might call today a career-defining moment. Except his career is Viking raiding, and the moment involves Greek fire eating through the mast above his head while Norman arrows whistle through the smoke. Now, I want you to understand the scale of what's happening here. 60 dragon ships had sailed from Norway just 3 months earlier. 60. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the equivalent of launching 60 aircraft carriers in modern terms, each one representing not just a massive investment in timber and iron, but the life's work of master craftsmen, the dreams of ambitious jarls, and the survival hopes of entire communities back home. But here's the thing about Vikings that most people don't grasp. They weren't just bloodthirsty raiders swinging axes and screaming at the sky. They were maritime entrepreneurs operating on razor-thin profit margins in one of the most unforgiving business environments imaginable. And right now, watching his father's fleet die ship by ship in the grey waters off the Norman coast, young Eirik is witnessing the fundamental problem that would eventually kill the Viking Age. Logistics. See, of those 60 magnificent dragon ships, barely 20 would limp home. Their holds? Empty. No grain, no silver, no anything except wounded men and bitter lessons. The mathematics of destruction were brutally simple. For every 10 ships that sailed, 4 would never return, 3 would come back damaged, 2 would arrive with their crews decimated by disease or starvation, and maybe, one would actually show a profit. But let's back up and understand how Eirik got here, because his story begins not with this disaster, but in the bustling shipwright community of Kaupang, where as a boy he learned a statistic that would haunt him forever. 6 of every 10 supply barrels never reached their destination. 6 out of 10. Imagine if 60% of Amazon packages just vanished. The business model would collapse overnight. Young Eirik grew up watching his grandfather Thorkel the steady curse as he tallied the losses each season. Ships separated from their fleets in storms, supply vessels picked off by enemy raiders, provisions spoiled when expeditions lasted longer than planned. The boy had a mind for numbers, unusual among Vikings, who typically thought in terms of honor and glory rather than accounting ledgers. But Eirik saw patterns where others saw only bad luck. His apprenticeship under Thorvald Stormcrow, the master navigator, opened his eyes even wider. Thorvald could read weather patterns like other men read runes, but even he admitted the bitter truth. A fleet is only as strong as its weakest link, boy, and that link is always the supply chain. Those words would echo in Eirik's mind for decades. Then came his meeting with Ahmad ibn Rashid, the Arab merchant who would unknowingly plant the seed of revolution in the young Viking's mind. Picture Ahmad in the trading posts of Hedeby, this sophisticated desert trader trying to explain to curious Norsemen how caravan routes worked across the seemingly impossible expanses of sand and rock. "You see," Ahmad would say, gesturing with hands that spoke as eloquently as his voice, "the caravans move like beaded necklaces across the sand seas. Each bead, each camel, each merchant, each water-bearer, connected to the next. If one bead breaks free, it dies alone in the desert. But together, moving as one creature, they can cross distances that would kill any individual traveller." Most Vikings nodded politely and went back to discussing axe weights and shield designs. But Eirik stared at Ahmad's drawings of connected caravans and saw something that made his pulse quicken. What if ships could move like that? What if a fleet could maintain connection across the vast waters the same way desert caravans maintained connection across endless sand? Now we return to that burning supply ship off the Norman coast, where all these childhood observations and dreams are crystallizing into desperate necessity. As Greek fire spreads across the deck above him, Eirik isn't just fighting for his life, he's calculating. How many men are starving right now because their supply ship fell behind yesterday? How many raids have failed this season for want of fresh water or preserved meat? How many kingdoms remain unconquered simply because Vikings can't maintain supply lines beyond 30 days of sailing? The mathematics of loss are written in blood and flame all around him. But as he prepares for his desperate swim to shore through burning oil, young Eirik Weathereye makes a vow that will transform naval warfare forever. He will find a way to stop this endless hemorrhage of supplies that bleeds Viking expansion dry. His escape through those nightmare waters, dodging flaming debris and Norman arrows while swimming toward a hostile shore, becomes a 3-month odyssey aboard a damaged trader. Every day of that journey home, he's sketching, calculating, refining his impossible dream. What would it take to keep ships connected across storm-tossed seas? What kind of materials could withstand the crushing forces of ocean swells while still allowing independent movement? How could you maintain formation when fog blinds the fleet and winds scatter ships like leaves? By the time that damaged trader limps into Bergen Harbour, Eirik Weathereye has covered every scrap of vellum aboard with diagrams that look like the fevered dreams of a madman. Ships connected by lines and cables, moving in perfect coordination across imaginary seas. The other survivors shake their heads and mutter about battle shock, affecting his mind. But Eirik knows better. He's seen the future of naval warfare, and it looks like Ahmad's desert caravans translated into Viking dragon ships. The only question is whether he can convince his people to abandon 1,000 years of maritime tradition before that tradition kills them all. The young man who stumbles ashore in Bergen is no longer just another Viking warrior. He's become something new, something dangerous, an innovator in a culture that worships the old ways. And his innovation will either save the Viking Age or destroy it completely. What happens when tradition meets revolution on the unforgiving seas of the North Atlantic? When the most conservative maritime culture in the world suddenly faces a teenage visionary who wants to chain their sacred dragon ships together like cargo barges? That's where our story really begins. 3 years. That's how long it took for Eirik Weathereye to transform from laughingstock to visionary. 3 years of mockery, failure, and the kind of obsessive experimentation that marks the difference between dreamers and revolutionaries. Picture the scene. The Great Assembly at Trondheim, 955 after Christ. The most powerful jarls in Norway gathered in the massive timber hall, their breath steaming in the cold air as they debate matters of war and trade. And there stands 20-year-old Eirik, holding what looks like a child's toy. Tiny wooden ships connected by silken threads, moving as one creature across a tabletop sea. The laughter is immediate and brutal. Eirik the Mad, they call him. Eirik Chaindragger. Eirik who forgets Vikings sail alone. These are men who've spent their lives commanding independent dragon ships, masters of their own destiny on the open sea. The idea of connecting their vessels, OZI, their symbols of freedom and power, strikes them as not just foolish, but fundamentally un-Viking. But here's what those laughing warriors don't understand. Eirik hasn't spent 3 years just dreaming. He's been calculating, testing, failing, and learning from every spectacular disaster. Because let me tell you, there were disasters. His first alliance was with Ingvar Ironwhisper's smithing clan. Now, Ingvar was known throughout Norway for his ability to forge iron that could withstand ship ramming without shattering. But when Eirik approached him with drawings of swivel joints and flexible connectors, the old smith thought the boy had lost his mind. You want me to forge chains that bend but don't break, links that swivel in all directions but still bear the weight of ships in storm seas? Ingvar scratched his grey beard and studied the sketches. Boy, you're asking me to reinvent metalworking. And that's exactly what they did. Month after month in the smoking forges, testing different alloys, different joint designs, different approaches to the fundamental problem. How do you create something flexible enough to allow independent ship movement, but strong enough to hold a fleet together when 40-foot waves are trying to tear it apart? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Astrid Ropeweaver. Now, in most Viking societies, rope-making was considered women's work. Important, certainly, but hardly the stuff of military innovation. Astrid, however, understood load-bearing fibres better than any shipwright in Norway. When she examined Eirik's early chain prototypes, She immediately spotted the fatal flaw. "You're thinking like a smith," she told him bluntly. "All rigid strength and no give. The sea doesn't fight strength, it flows around it, under it, through it. Your chains need to breathe with the waves, not resist them." This was the moment everything changed. Instead of trying to create unbreakable, rigid connections, they developed what Astrid called living links, graduated hemp cables, reinforced with iron components at stress points, designed to stretch and contract with wave action while maintaining formation integrity. But even perfecting the physical connections was only half the battle. The real innovation came in solving the communication problem. How do you keep 20 ships in formation when fog rolls in and you can't see beyond your own bow? How do you coordinate turns and speed changes across a spread of vessels when shouting won't carry past the nearest ship? Enter the drum caller system. Each ship carried a rhythm keeper, Jumpelo, usually someone with musical training, who maintained formation through sound patterns that could penetrate fog, storm noise, and the general chaos of sea travel. Different drum sequences meant different maneuvers. 3 long beats followed by 2 short meant prepare to turn to starboard. A rapid staccato meant increase speed. A slow, steady rhythm meant maintain current course and spacing. The first trials in the protected fjords were, well, let's just say they provided entertainment for half of Trondheim. Rigid chains snapped in moderate swells, sending ship fragments, flying like catapult stones. Crews got tangled in their own rigging when they tried to adjust sail while connected. One memorable day, Eirik's test fleet managed to tie itself into such a complex knot that it took 6 hours and 3 rowboats to separate the ships. But each failure taught them something crucial. They learned that slack and flexibility mattered more than raw strength. They discovered that ships naturally want to move in harmony with wave patterns. Fighting that natural rhythm was what broke their early chain systems. Most importantly, they realized that successful formation sailing required not just physical connections but mental ones. Crews had to think as parts of a larger organism rather than as independent units. The real test came when Jarl Hakon Goldbeard, Eirik's, old, skeptical, and powerful enough to crush Eirik's dreams with a word, issued his challenge. 2 fleets of 20 ships each would sail from Trondheim to the Orkneys and back through autumn storms. A supply race, he called it. Hakon's traditional fleet against Eirik's experimental chain formation. Winner takes all. Now understand, autumn in the North Sea is not sailing weather for the faint-hearted. Storms blow up from nowhere. Waves reach heights that make grown Vikings pray to every god they know, and visibility can drop to 0 in minutes. Traditional Viking fleets dealt with these conditions by accepting massive losses. Ships would scatter in storms and hope to regroup later, often losing a third of their vessels in the process. Hakon's fleet followed the old ways. When the first major storm hit 3 days out from Trondheim, his ships scattered like frightened fish. Some rode out the storm alone, others found shelter in various coves and inlets. A few simply vanished into the grey chaos and were never seen again. It took him 5 days just to reassemble enough ships to continue the journey. Meanwhile, Eirik's chain fleet moved through that same storm like a sea serpent, flexing and bending but never breaking formation. When waves threatened to tear the connections apart, the graduated cables stretched to absorb the force. When fog blinded the lead ships, the drum callers maintained course through sound alone. When one vessel took damage, the formation adjusted to protect it without breaking apart. The results spoke louder than any argument. Hakon's traditional fleet limped home with 7 ships out of 20, their holds nearly empty after losing supply vessels to storms and raiders. They'd completed the round trip, technically, but barely. Eirik's chain fleet arrived intact, all 20 ships, having lost only 2% of their provisions. In 1 month, mockery transformed to awe. The same Jarls who'd called him mad were now pledging their ships to learn the new way. But here's the thing about revolutions. They create as many enemies as converts. For every ambitious captain who saw opportunity in Eirik's methods, there was another who saw threat. Traditional naval power structures were built around individual ship commanders and their personal relationships with crew and jarls. Chain fleet sailing required submitting individual authority to formation discipline. Some Vikings adapted to this new reality. Others began plotting against it. As word of the supply race results spread across Scandinavia, Eirik Weatherai found himself at the center of a transformation he was only beginning to understand. His innovation had proven itself in the most demanding test possible, actual sea conditions against experienced competition. But proving a concept and revolutionizing an entire maritime culture, those are two very different challenges, and the second one was about to test not just Eirik's engineering skills, but his understanding of human nature itself. What happens when individual Vikings must learn to sail as a collective organism? When pride and independence collide with efficiency and survival? When the very success of an innovation creates the forces that will eventually destroy it? The chains that would connect ships were about to bind their creator in ways he never imagined. By 961, after Christ, a line, just 9 years after that desperate swim through burning oil off the Norman coast, the sight of Eirik's grand fleet moving across the North Sea struck terror and wonder in equal measure. Picture this: 200 vessels, moving as a single organism. Supply ships protected in the center, while war dragons patrol the edges, the entire formation breathing like a great sea beast as it adjusts to wind and wave. 200 ships. To understand the scale we're talking about here, imagine seeing 200 Boeing 747s flying in perfect formation. Except these aren't just flying, they're connected, coordinated, functioning as parts of a machine that shouldn't be possible but absolutely undeniably exists. This wasn't just a fleet anymore. This was a floating civilization. At the heart of this maritime revolution was a social transformation that nobody, not even Eirik himself, had anticipated. The chain fleet didn't just change how Vikings sailed, it changed how they lived, worked, and thought about themselves in relation to others. Take young Bjorn Shipborn, for instance. Born in 959 aboard the supply vessel Times Wales Bounty Asterisk, Bjorn represents something entirely new in Viking culture. A warrior who grew from infant to fighting man without ever setting foot on solid ground for more than a few weeks at a time. His entire world was the interconnected ships of the chain fleet. His family, the crews of a dozen vessels. His playground, the rigging and ropeways that connected one floating island to another. Bjorn spoke the emerging chain dialect, ITT, a mixture of Norse with borrowed words from every coast the fleet had touched. He could navigate by stars that most land-bound Vikings had never heard of, and he understood formation tactics the way other children understood farm work. Most remarkably, he thought of himself not as belonging to any single ship, but as a citizen of the fleet itself. Then there was Gudrun the Healer, whose floating medical ships represented another innovation nobody had planned for. Traditional Viking raids were brutal, short affairs where wounded warriors either recovered quickly or died. But chain fleet campaigns could last 18 months, and that changed everything about battlefield medicine. Gudrun's hospital ships, ASSA, converted dragon vessels with expanded holds and specialized equipment, ASA, allowed wounded men to recover while still traveling with their brothers in arms. She developed techniques for surgery in heavy seas, created systems for moving patients between ships during storms, and pioneered the use of formation-flying messenger birds to coordinate medical care across the entire fleet. But perhaps most importantly, her work attracted women to sea service in unprecedented numbers. Female healers, rope specialists, formation keepers, and supply coordinators found themselves wielding influence equal to traditional male warriors. The chain fleet's complexity required skills that had nothing to do with sword work, and that opened doors that had been sealed shut for centuries. And then there was Olaf Brewmaster, whose floating brewery might sound like a joke until you understand the deadly serious problem it solved. Scurvy, what we now know results from vitamin deficiency, was the silent killer of long voyages. Traditional Viking expeditions dealt with this by keeping trips short and relying on frequent resupply from shore. But the chain fleet's ability to sustain itself for extended periods created a new challenge. How do you keep 200 ships' worth of men healthy during 18-month campaigns? Olaf's answer was elegant in its simplicity. Fresh ale, brewed continuously aboard specialized vessels using grain stores that were constantly replenished through the fleet's efficient supply network. His brewery ships became social centers where crews from different vessels gathered during calm weather, sharing news, songs, and the latest formation sailing techniques while staying healthy on long voyages. The social structures that emerged from all this were unlike anything in Viking tradition. Position in the formation became more prestigious than individual ship ownership. Chain crews developed their own elaborate hierarchies based on formation-keeping skills rather than individual combat prowess. The rope weavers and formation keepers found themselves elevated to positions of influence that would have been unthinkable in traditional Viking society. But it was the fleet's tactical capabilities that truly demonstrated the revolution Eirik had unleashed. Consider the impossible siege of London, where his chain fleet created a floating fortress across the Thames that maintained position for 18 months until the city surrendered. Traditional Viking fleets couldn't sustain extended sieges because they couldn't maintain their positions. Ships would drift with tides and currents, supply lines would break down, crew morale would collapse as men grew tired of sleeping on beaches and eating spoiled food. Most Viking attacks on fortified positions were necessarily quick strikes. Peter hit hard. Grab what you can. Get out before organized resistance develops. But Eirik's chain fleet turned siege warfare into an engineering problem. The formation could anchor itself across the river like a bridge, with supply ships constantly rotating fresh provisions and men while maintaining the blockade. Hospital ships kept wounded warriors fighting fit, brewery ships kept morale high, workshop ships repaired weapons and tackle. The floating fortress became more stable and better supplied than many land-based fortifications. For 18 months, London starved while the Viking fleet outside their walls actually grew stronger and more organized. When the city finally surrendered, it wasn't because the Vikings had broken their walls. It was because the chain fleet had proven it could maintain pressure indefinitely, while traditional defences had finite resources. Even more spectacular was the great rescue at Skellig Michael, where the chain fleet saved 3,000 stranded Vikings from starvation by forming a supply bridge across storm-torn seas that individual ships could never navigate. Picture this: autumn storms in the North Atlantic, waves reaching 40 and 50 feet, winds that could tear sails to shreds in minutes. 3,000 Vikings trapped on a rocky island with winter closing in and no hope of rescue. Traditional thinking said the situation was hopeless. No captain would risk his ship and crew trying to reach Skellig Michael in those conditions. The best you could hope for was to return in spring and bury whatever bodies remained. But Eirik's chain fleet operated by different rules. The formation could absorb punishment that would destroy individual ships. Vessels could share loads, compensate for each other's weaknesses, maintain course through conditions that would scatter a traditional fleet like dandelion seeds. The rescue operation became a masterpiece of coordinated seamanship. Supply ships formed a chain from the mainland to the island, each vessel maintaining position while passing provisions forward link by link. When ships took damage, the formation adjusted to protect disabled vessels while continuing the mission. When crews became exhausted, fresh men rotated forward from reserve positions. It took 6 days of continuous operation in the worst weather the North Atlantic could produce. But when it was over, 3,000 Vikings had been evacuated to safety, and the chain fleet had demonstrated capabilities that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. By 961 after Christ, Eirik Weathereye commanded not just the largest fleet in Viking history, but something unprecedented. A floating nation that could project power across vast distances while sustaining itself indefinitely on the open sea. His innovation had achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a desperate 17-year-old swimming through burning oil. The endless hemorrhage of supplies that bled Viking expansion dry? Solved. The inability to maintain long-term campaigns? Eliminated. The vulnerability of scattered fleets in storm conditions? Neutralized. But as any student of history knows, success breeds its own problems. The very capabilities that made the chain fleet invincible were also making it too powerful for the traditional Viking world to tolerate. When innovation succeeds beyond all expectations, when it solves the problems it was designed to address while creating capabilities nobody anticipated, the next challenge isn't technical, it's political. And politics, as Eirik was about to discover, operates by rules that no amount of engineering brilliance can overcome. What happens when your solution works so well that it threatens the very system you were trying to improve? When success makes you too dangerous to live? That's the trap that awaits every true revolutionary, and Eirik Weathereye was about to walk straight into it. Every revolution breeds its own destruction. By 970 after Christ, 18 years after his desperate escape from burning Norman waters, Eirik Weathereye faced enemies more dangerous than any storm. His own success had created rivals among Vikings who saw his power as a threat to the old ways, while his most trusted student, Magnus Chainbreaker, secretly plotted to steal both his methods and his fleet. Here's the bitter irony that Eirik was only beginning to understand. His innovation's greatest achievement was also sealing its doom. The chain fleet's ability to maintain reliable supply lines had enabled permanent Viking settlement in ways that made the traditional raiding economy obsolete. Why risk everything on hit-and-run attacks when you could establish sustainable colonies backed by an unbreakable maritime supply network? But permanent settlements meant fewer raids. Fewer raids meant less plunder to distribute among ambitious jarls. Less plunder meant angry jarls looking for someone to blame. And there stood Eirik Weathereye with his floating empire, successful beyond any Viking leader in history, but threatening the very foundations of Viking culture. Think about it from the traditional jarl's perspective. For 3 centuries, Viking society had been built around independent ship commanders leading raids that brought wealth and glory back to their home communities. Individual prowess, personal leadership, and the freedom to sail where you chose, when you chose, these weren't just tactical preferences, they were cultural identity. Now here comes this upstart with his connected fleets and formation discipline, demonstrating that coordinated group action could achieve what individual heroics never could. Worse, he was proving that the old ways weren't just inefficient, they were actively destructive. Every traditional fleet that tried to operate alongside Eirik's chain formations looked clumsy, wasteful, and weak by comparison. Magnus Chainbreaker understood this resentment better than Eirik ever did. Magnus had been one of Eirik's earliest students, learning formation tactics and rope work with the dedication of a true believer. But where Eirik saw his innovation as a tool for strengthening Viking capabilities, Magnus saw it as a weapon for seizing power. "You think too small, old friend," Magnus would say during their strategy sessions aboard Eirik's flagship. "These chains you've forged don't just connect ships, they could connect all of Viking Scandinavia under proper leadership." Eirik, focused on tactical improvements and logistical solutions, missed the ambition burning in his students' eyes. He was an engineer trying to optimize a system. Magnus was a politician planning to own it. The conspiracy that brought Eirik down was as elegant as it was ruthless. 20 traditional jarls, each commanding between 5 and 15 ships, secretly coordinated with Magnus to trap the great chain fleet in Hardanger Fjord during what was supposed to be a routine winter resupply operation. The Battle of Dragon's Teeth began before dawn on a grey morning in late 970. Eirik's fleet lay anchored in formation, taking on provisions and fresh water from the fjord settlements, when Magnus signalled the attack by deliberately cutting the formation cables of his own squadron. Picture the chaos. Suddenly, 40 ships that had moved as one organism for months found themselves tangled in their own rigging as severed chains whipped through the air like iron serpents. Crews who'd trained for years to maintain formation discipline found themselves fighting for basic survival as their own innovation turned against them. But the real brilliance of the ambush was tactical. The conspirators had studied Eirik's methods well enough to turn them inside out. They used his own formation principles against him, coordinating their attack through drum signals, while his forces struggled with damaged communication systems. They targeted the rope weavers and formation keepers first, knowing that killing the specialists would cripple the chain fleet's ability to reorganize. Most devastatingly, they had chosen their battlefield perfectly. Hardangerfjord's narrow waters negated the chain fleet's advantages in open sea maneuvering while giving traditional Viking ships room to use their superior individual agility. The fighting was desperate and bitter. Eirik's men had numerical superiority and better organization, but they were trapped in confined waters with damaged equipment and betrayal spreading through their ranks as more of Magnus's hidden supporters revealed themselves. For 6 hours, the fjord burned with the largest naval battle in Viking history. Ship rammed ship, boarding parties swarmed across tangled rigging, and the water turned red with blood, while seabirds screamed overhead like Valkyries choosing the slain. But even in defeat, Eirik demonstrated why logistics trump violence. Years of careful planning had established emergency supply caches all along the Norwegian coast, hidden depots known only to his most trusted captains. When the battle turned against him, when his great formation was broken and burning, Eirik didn't try to fight to the bitter end like a traditional Viking hero. Instead, he did what he'd always done. He adapted. 13 ships managed to cut themselves free from the chaos and escape seaward, using predetermined signals to coordinate their retreat. Within hours, they were accessing the first of Eirik's supply caches, already beginning the process of regrouping for continued resistance. Magnus claimed victory and declared himself the new master of chain fleet tactics. The traditional Jarls celebrated the destruction of Eirik's floating empire, but they'd won a battle while losing the war, because the real secret of Eirik's success wasn't the chains or the formations or even the tactical innovations. It was the mindset, the understanding that sustainable success requires thinking beyond the immediate conflict to the systems that support long-term objectives. Magnus could steal Eirik's ships and copy his methods, but he couldn't steal the engineering mind that had created them. Eirik's last winter was spent not in battle but in teaching. Hidden in a remote Iceland settlement with his 13 surviving ships pulled up on the beach, he did something no defeated Viking leader had ever done. He documented everything. Working by whale oil lamplight in a stone hut barely large enough for 3 men, Eirik transcribed his life's work onto vellum. Formation tactics, rope specifications, supply, calculations, weather reading techniques, emergency procedures, every hard-won lesson from 18 years of maritime innovation went into what would become known as the Chainkeeper's Codex. More importantly, he trained a final generation of students, including his grandson Leif, in the principles behind the methods. Not just how to tie formation knots or read drum signals, but why flexibility matters more than strength, why systems thinking trumps individual heroics, why true innovation requires understanding the deeper patterns that connect all things. His death came peacefully in the spring of 971, the old wolf passing while watching young crews practice formation dancing in the harbour below. He was 56 years old, ancient by Viking standards, 20 years, and he died knowing that his innovation would outlive him even if his empire had not. The epilogue of Eirik's story proves that true innovation never dies but transforms, link by link, across the centuries. Byzantine merchants adapted chain fleet principles for their grain convoys, creating supply networks that sustained Constantinople for generations. Hanseatic traders 3 centuries later rediscovered his writings and revolutionized Baltic commerce, building the economic foundation for northern European prosperity. Echo traces of the formation serpent appear in naval tactics through the age of sail and beyond. Modern convoy procedures, fleet coordination protocols, even the basic concepts of supply chain management all bear the genetic fingerprints of innovations first tested in the storm-tossed waters off Norway 1,000 years ago. Magnus Chainbreaker's empire lasted barely 5 years before collapsing into the same factional warfare that had plagued Vikings for centuries. The traditional Jarls who celebrated Eirik's defeat found themselves facing the same old problems: inadequate supplies, scattered fleets, and the gradual realization that the world was changing in ways that made traditional Viking methods obsolete. But Eirik's true monument wasn't built of wood and iron. It was built of ideas, passed down through generations of sailors who understood that connection creates strength, that coordination enables capabilities impossible for individuals acting alone, and that the greatest innovations often come from solving the mundane, practical problems that everyone else takes for granted. Today, when massive container ships cross the oceans in coordinated fleets, when supply chains span continents, when global commerce depends on precisely the kind of systematic thinking that Eirik pioneered, we're still living in the world his innovation created. Every time efficiency triumphs over individual heroics, every time systematic planning overcomes chaotic improvisation, every time human beings choose to work together rather than compete alone, the ghost of Eirik Weatherized chain fleet moves across the waters of history. His dragons learned to dance, and, in learning, they changed the world forever.